When the Americans went to war after September 11th, they went big. US Special Operations Command, SOCOM, had roughly 45,000 to 50,000 personnel in the years after the attacks, with a budget running at $5 to $6 billion a year. Under JSOC, the classified Inner Ring, sat Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, and the 75th Ranger Regiment, around 3,500 Rangers alone across 3 full battalions. The machinery of American Special Operations was vast, expensive, and entirely confident in itself. Alongside it, in Iraq and in Afghanistan, went a regiment that could fit inside a single American battalion. The entire 22 SAS regiment, its 4 Sabre Squadrons, its headquarters elements, its signals and training staff, every badged operator and support soldier, numbered somewhere between 400 and 600 all ranks. Delta Force alone was larger than 22 SAS in personnel terms. The Special Boat Service added another 200 or so operators. The total United Kingdom Special Forces establishment going into the 2003 Iraq invasion was well under 2,000 people. That arithmetic wasn't lost on the Americans. The gap was real. JSOC's task force in Iraq was built around Delta and DEV-GRU, supported by the Rangers, with ISR assets, dedicated aviation from the 161st SOAR, and an intelligence architecture that most countries' entire militaries couldn't field. JSOC's size during the surge years grew from roughly 800 personnel to over 2,300 by 2008, and that was just the command element. British Special Forces didn't come close to matching any of that on paper. The SAS has 4 operational Sabre Squadrons, A, B, D and G, each built around 4 16-man troops. 4 squadrons, 400 to 600 people in the regiment as a whole. The SBS added another 200. In 2003, before the post-9/11 expansions had fully built out, the Special Reconnaissance Regiment hadn't yet been formed. The Special Forces Support Group didn't yet exist. The entire UK Special Forces Group was smaller than many individual US brigades. Any senior American officer looking at those numbers had a reasonable question. What does a force this small actually add to a war this large? The answer had already been written into the foundations of American Special Operations, though most people didn't think of it that way. In 1962, an American Army Ranger named Charlie Beckwith arrived at 22 SAS in Hereford on exchange posting. He was blunt, physical, opinionated, and completely unprepared for what he found. The SAS's approach to selection, small team autonomous operations, and the cultivation of individual operator judgment was unlike anything in the US Army structure. He spent a year absorbing it. He went home changed. In 1977, after 15 years of advocacy, he founded 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, Delta Force, explicitly modelled on 22 SAS after his exchange at Hereford. The unit that would lead the American counter-terrorism campaign in Iraq was built, in its foundational philosophy, on a British blueprint. Delta's operators wouldn't have framed it that way by 2003. They had more than 2 decades of their own history by then, their own methods, their own pride, and they were right that the debt was indirect by now. Delta was its own thing, shaped by Mogadishu and Panama and a dozen classified operations. But the founding relationship was documented fact. The architecture of American Tier 1 counter-terrorism had been laid on a Hereford foundation. That context sat in the background as the two forces converged on Iraq. If you followed this channel's coverage of the Bravo 20 patrol, when an 8-man SAS team ran from compromised into legend in western Iraq in January 1991, you already know the regiment's way of operating in that part of the world. This is what came next. The formal joint counter-terror structure in Iraq took shape in the weeks after the invasion. JSOC stood up Task Force 20, later redesignated Task Force 121, then Task Force 6-26, then Task Force 145, then Task Force 88, and eventually Task Force 714 during McChrystal's command. British Special Forces operated under their own designation, Task Force 14, which BBC journalist Mark Urban, whose 2010 book Task Force Black remains the closest thing to a definitive public account of these operations, calls Task Force Black. American side documents use their own designations. Task Force Black is the UK and media term for the SAS component, not a formal JSOC designation. The naming matters less than the structure. Two separate but tightly linked counter-terror machines, sharing intelligence, coordinating raids, operating from the same facilities. In the early period, 2003 to 2006, the two forces ran alongside each other under separate national command. McChrystal, who took charge of JSOC in 2003, deliberately kept Task Force Black outside the JSOC command chain. The British SF maintained their own command authority, reported to their own directors back in Hereford and London. But they shared the same targeting intelligence, operated out of the same compounds, and fed results back into the same network. The main operating base was Camp Nama, the Special Operations facility at Baghdad International Airport that served as Task Force 121's primary operations centre before it relocated to Balad Air Base, 68 kilometres north of the city. British and American operators occupied the same compound, briefed in the same operations centres. Not subordinated, but not separate either. McChrystal later described the transformation he drove at JSOC in Iraq as building a team of teams, removing the information barriers between units and agencies so intelligence flowed laterally rather than being hoarded vertically. That model was built on the premise that the machine got faster when every node both produced and consumed intelligence. British SF were inside that model. They weren't observers to the system, they were participants, generating the targeting packets that drove the next raids and receiving the packets that generated their own. The method was F3EAD: find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, disseminate. A raid produced detainees. Detainees produced intelligence. Intelligence produced the next target. That cycle ran every night during the peak years. The Survival Journal, the flagship publication of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, described Urban's account of these operations as essential reading alongside McChrystal's memoir, noting that Urban's book contains more tactical detail of SAS raids and combat in Iraq, which usefully complements McChrystal's higher-level account. The British integration deepened substantially in 2006. McChrystal drew Task Force Black formally inside the JSOC architecture. British SAS became nodes in the same intelligence operations network that Delta and DEVGRU were running through, receiving targeting packets and generating intelligence that drove the next night's work. The word that American observers began to use, according to Urban's reporting from sources on both sides, was integral. Not attached, not adjacent, integral. That status was earned through specific operations. In November 2005, 4 members of a Christian peacemaker charity were kidnapped in Baghdad. Task Force Black launched Operation Lightwater, led by B Squadron 22 SAS, to find them. Over the following weeks, the task force raided 50 buildings in and around Baghdad. 44 of those raids executed by British Special Forces, detaining 47 individuals, building an intelligence trail from mobile phone data, running the kind of sustained exploitation and raid cycle that the F-3 EAD model was designed for. On the 23rd of March 2006, Operation Nay 3 hit a residence in Mashhada, 20 miles northwest of Baghdad. 2 individuals taken. Under questioning, they gave up the location of the hostages in western Baghdad. B Squadron breached the building at 0800 hours. The hostages were alive. April 2006 brought Operation Larchwood 4. SAS and Delta together, targeting Al-Qaeda in Iraq cells in what intelligence had identified as the Baghdad Belts, the ring of towns where AQI had built its urban support networks. Night operations on the 8th and 13th of April near Yusufia. 7 insurgents killed. More importantly, intelligence recovered that gave JSOC a clearer picture of AQI's entire Baghdad area structure and fed the next cycle. September 2005 added a different kind of proof. 2 undercover SAS operators conducting Operation Hathor, monitoring local police for Iranian influence in Basra, were arrested by Iraqi police at a roadblock after a confrontation. British Army forces were dispatched. Warrior armoured vehicles broke through the prison walls and the 2 operators were extracted. The episode generated enormous political friction, and the name Task Force Black leaked to the press in its aftermath. But it also demonstrated something operationally important. The SAS had enough reach and reserve capacity in Iraq to mount an emergency extraction of its own personnel without halting its main counter-terror mission. That kind of depth doesn't belong to a courtesy attachment. Understanding what the Americans actually concluded about these operators requires being precise about sources. This is where the temptation to overstate is greatest, and where overstatement would destroy the argument. Mark Urban spent years cultivating sources inside both the British and American Special Forces communities for Task Force Black. The Observer's reviewer noted that few reporters succeed in cultivating any sources within the closed world of the British Special Forces. Urban has found dozens who have spoken with unprecedented candour. Kim Sengupta in The Independent described the result as the first account, as full as it can be under the circumstances, of the clandestine war waged by the SAS and their Royal Marines equivalent, the SBS, alongside US Delta Force in the height of that murderous war. Urban's editorial conclusion, drawn from sources on both sides of the Atlantic, was that US JSOC officers came to regard the SAS as an integral part of the Iraq high-value target machine. That's a journalist's synthesis of what many American sources told him, not a single named general's quote. But it carries weight precisely because of the access that generated it. The most direct documented American testimony comes from a specific and verifiable moment. A US Army 4-star general, on camera, described his forces training with SAS instructors at Fort Polk, Louisiana, a 2-month period of hands-on tactical instruction before deploying. The tactics learned in that training, the general stated, were used by his forces in Baghdad, Fallujah and Najaf in 2004. He mentioned practical specifics, hands-on instruction in techniques including how to cut wires in an urban environment. This isn't ceremony. A 4-star American general, on record, is confirming that his troops went into the 3 hardest urban battles of that year using techniques taught to them by the British. The context for why British CQB methodology carried that authority goes back to 1966. That's when 22 SAS established its Close Quarter Battle Course at Hereford, one of the first formalised programmes of its kind in the Western world. The course addressed a specific problem: how to engage threats precisely in confined civilian environments, how to discriminate between armed and unarmed individuals at close range, how to move through buildings at high speed without producing the casualty pattern of a conventional firefight. Academic research published in military journals confirms that CQB as a formalised discipline, precision urban tactics at the level of the infantry squad, was first developed by special forces in roughly this period, with the SAS as the primary innovator. Over the following decades, that methodology filtered outward. Beckwith's Delta inherited versions of it at founding. But the SAS had been running the original for 35 years before their instructors arrived at Fort Polk. In Iraq, that depth showed up in operational specifics. British operators had been deliberately wearing US pattern camouflage and using US standard equipment in the field, a detail Urban documents in Task Force Black. Operating visually indistinguishable from Delta meant lower signature, easier coordination, no friction on joint objectives. The British operators had integrated themselves into the aesthetic of US Tier 1, which is its own statement about how seriously they took the partnership, and how seriously the Americans took them back. Multiple independent sources confirm that Washington specifically sought British SF capabilities in Iraq and Afghanistan, not just the political value of British participation in the coalition. Government risk assessments, journalistic accounts, and defense analysis sources consistently make this distinction. The United States wanted what these operators could do, not merely the flag they carried. When governments deploy troops in coalition, allies sometimes bring numbers or political legitimacy. The Americans wanted the SAS's specific capabilities. That's a different kind of request entirely. Sean Naylor's Relentless Strike, the most detailed publicly available history of JSOC, published in 2015, describes an organization growing from 800 to over 2,300 personnel during the surge years, demanding and receiving disproportionate shares of intelligence assets and aviation. It was an American enterprise running at American scale. What the British contribution provided wasn't numbers, it was institutional knowledge and operational methodology that the Americans couldn't replicate by growing their own headcount. Skills built over decades in Northern Ireland, Oman, the Falklands, and Sierra Leone, now applied to the specific problem of urban counter-network warfare. The Director of Special Forces made the operational division explicit around 2005. The SAS carried primary responsibility for Iraq. The SBS, the Special Boat Service, 22 SAS's Royal Marines equivalent, took primary responsibility for Afghanistan. Both forces were operating but in different theatres, under different task force designations. Task Force Night covered the SAS presence in Afghanistan. The SBS operated under designations that appear variously as Task Force 7 or Task Force 84 in different open sources. The role the SBS played in Afghanistan was operationally distinctive. According to the documented model, SBS teams were deployed as special reconnaissance elements, small groups embedded in terrain, watching target locations, building pattern-of-life intelligence on specific individuals over sustained periods. When the intelligence was solid, the SBS called in a direct action team from the JSOC task force to execute the capture or kill. The SBS provided eyes-on confirmation of the target. JSOC brought the assault teams. Together they completed the kill/capture chain that neither could have built as efficiently alone. That arrangement wasn't a consolation role for British SF. It reflected a genuine capability division based on what each force did best. The SBS brought the patience, the concealment skills, and the covert surveillance tradecraft developed over decades of operations, including Northern Ireland. JSOC brought the rapid aviation, the assault teams, and the intelligence exploitation infrastructure. The combination was specifically more effective than either force working alone, which is why the Americans kept returning to it. Helmand Province was where the bomb war was most intense. Sean Raymond, a defence journalist and former parachute regiment officer who embedded repeatedly in Helmand between August 2008 and March 2010, documented that environment in Bomb Hunters. His picture was of IED networks of extraordinary sophistication, with British forces finding as many as 15 devices per day in some areas. Bomb disposal teams working in 50-degree heat, taking what Raymond called the long walk into the kill zone again and again. The networks producing those devices weren't random. They were organised, resourced, and managed by facilitators who constituted high-value targets in their own right. Finding and removing those facilitators was Special Forces work. This is where British institutional memory applied in ways that were genuinely distinctive to anyone familiar with the source material. Operation Banner, the British Army's deployment to Northern Ireland, ran from 1969 to 2007, 38 years, the longest continuous military operation in British history. Over 250,000 military personnel served in the province across that period. The SAS operated covertly there from the mid-1970s onwards, developing skills in sustained covert surveillance, intelligence-led targeting, managing human intelligence networks, and conducting direct action within extreme legal and political constraints. The specific challenge of fighting an armed network embedded in a civilian population, building targeting intelligence on individuals rather than formations, minimizing collateral damage not from sentiment but from operational necessity, managing cases that would ultimately face legal scrutiny, was exactly what Helmand required. King's College London's 2022 academic study of Operation Banner notes that the British Army's 2009 counterinsurgency field manual explicitly identified the failure to capture lessons from Northern Ireland as a stark omission. The SAS, by contrast, had been absorbing those lessons operationally for 30 years. Academic work tracing British military intelligence doctrine from Northern Ireland to Afghanistan documents the institutional connections, the ways that targeting methodology developed against pirate networks informed, sometimes directly, the approach to Taliban IED networks in Helmand. American commanders were aware of this background, even when they didn't say so on the record. Named American testimony, explicitly framing the Northern Ireland advantage in those terms, is thin in publicly accessible sources. It's primarily a British and analytical construct, rather than something US officers have articulated in print. But the operational model itself tells the story. The Americans designed the JSOC British SF partnership in Afghanistan with the SBS in the special reconnaissance role, calling in American direct action elements. That design reflects an assessment of what British operators brought that was genuinely specific, not generic. There were complications in the British SF contribution that honest reporting requires acknowledging. A period around 2004 to 2005 produced documented friction between SAS and SBS operators in Iraq, with reported disagreements over standards of performance on high-tempo urban operations. Urban's Observer reviewer noted that some of his sources were furthering personal agendas, reflecting tensions within the SAS. British Special Forces in these wars were capable, respected, and also, at times, imperfect and internally contested, like any organisation operating at the edge of its capacity over extended years. The Americans who worked alongside them knew both versions of the story. The most telling thing about the sustained American assessment of British Special Forces isn't any single quote. It's what the Americans kept doing. Post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan, the operational relationship didn't diminish, it deepened and formalized. When US Special Forces conducted the overnight raid targeting ISIS operative Abu Sayyaf in Syria in 2015, SAS troops were reported to have participated dressed in US uniforms. The integration had become physical and visual. British operators indistinguishable from their American counterparts because they'd been operating together long enough that the distinction had ceased to matter in the field. In 2024, General Brian Fenton, the commanding general of US Special Operations Command, told Associated Press that SOCOM was learning about the war in Ukraine mostly through the eyes of our UK Special Operations partners. That's the head of the world's largest Special Operations Command, an organisation with 70,000 personnel and a budget that dwarfs the entire UK defence budget, describing British SF as his primary intelligence lens on a major ongoing conflict. That's not diplomatic language. That's an operational assessment of where the most useful eyes are positioned. McChrystal's team of teams concept, the model that transformed JSOC in Iraq, rested on the principle that the best units get better when they share freely with trusted allied partners, rather than hoarding capability. British SF were inside that model from the moment it became the operating principle at Balad. They weren't brought in from the margins as the machine got bigger. They were woven into the architecture before the architecture reached its full scale. And they stayed there because the results justified the decision. The academic record has settled the question of Urban's book in a particular way. The IISS's Survival Journal reviewed McChrystal's memoir and Urban's Task Force Black together in 2013. Treating them as complementary accounts, the high command view alongside the tactical level view of the same operation. An institution that defines the standards of defence analysis treated these as the canonical texts. What happened between the SAS and JSOC in Iraq was significant enough to require 2 books and remain required reading a decade on. The founding story closes the circle in a way that neither side needs to make explicit. Delta Force was built by a man who spent a year with the SAS and came home convinced that the British approach to selection and small team operations was the model worth replicating. Every time a Delta operator walked onto a joint objective with SAS counterparts in Baghdad or Balad, sharing the same targeting intelligence, wearing the same camouflage pattern, working within the same F3 EAD cycle, the founding story was present in the background, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Charlie Beckwith modelled Delta on the regiment he'd found at Hereford. The regiment at Hereford had built the CQB course that every serious counter-terror unit in the Western world now teaches from. The 4-star general who stood at Fort Polk confirming that his troops had used SAS-taught tactics in Fallujah was, in some sense, closing a loop that began in 1962 when a blunt American Ranger arrived in Herefordshire and encountered something he'd never seen before. The Americans didn't need to be impressed. They had the biggest special operations force on Earth, their own legends, their own pride, and every structural reason to see a few hundred British soldiers as a peripheral attachment to a war they were running at industrial scale. What changed their minds wasn't a story or a reputation. It was watching the SAS and the SBS work night after night on the hardest objectives of 2 long wars. When soldiers with everything to be proud of keep requesting your regiment on the target with them, when they certify your tactics in front of a camera, when their top command describes your operators as the best eyes they have on a continent-wide conflict, they are paying the only compliment that can't be bought, inherited, or exaggerated. The British Special Forces walked into the post-9/11 wars having to prove a legend to the one audience immune to legends. They walked out with the Americans repeating it for them. If you want more stories told this way, sourced, specific, and from the ground up, subscribe. There's more to come.